So welcome to Haftarah study for Parashat Mishpatim. We are over and into a new week already. Just a quick review for folks who might be watching this on YouTube. I think most of you all have been part of Haftarah study before, but we are learning about the Nach, the rest of the Tanakh that is not the Torah reading. The Haftarah reading in synagogue usually has some kind of thematic connection to the Parsha, or particular relevance to the occasion. That'll actually be the case this week because this is going to be the first, Shabbat Shkalim is either the last Shabbat of the month of Shvat before Adar, or in this case on the first of Adar. So there's actually going to be a special Haftarah that would be read in synagogue this week. This would be the Haftarah that we would read if it was an ordinary Shabbat. It was most interesting, but I think it's been pretty fun to read these Haftarah because they're texts we don't normally see, we don't normally dig into, but there's lots to find here. There are lots of theories about how reading Haftarah got started, but somebody picked this, somebody chose this text to read because it spoke to them in some way. The selection of verses for Haftarah readings is also varied between Jewish communities. So like I just said, sort of taking some license in terms of what we focus on here, but we'll give a brief overview of the Torah portion, Parashat Mishpatim. Then we'll go over some background on the book that the Haftarah comes from, in this case, the book of Jeremiah. And then we'll dive in and kind of see what comes up. Some questions we'll touch on, again, back at the end of our learning. Kind of looking at how this text has spoken to Jews who've read it across time. So how, at the time when it was written, how is this text to communities who have read it in synagogue, who've read it as a Haftarah on a weekly basis? Also, for our part, how does this text speak to us as Jews today who are reading it in here? Okay, looks like I'm having a little trouble. So if you can't hear me, let me know. Okay. So Parashat Mishpatim, which is in Exodus, begins in chapter 21, runs through chapter 24. In Parashat Mishpatim, the people are still encamped at Mount Sinai. They received the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, last week. They witnessed the revelation of Mount Sinai, and now God is in the process of mediating more laws, but this time, instead of directly to the people, mediating them through Moses. So some Bible critics, is a self-contained document. So we get a bunch of laws, interpersonal laws relating to treatment of slaves, for one. Everything from that to exhibiting kindness towards other strangers. We get a bunch of what they call cultic laws having to do with the sacrificial cult, including the commandment to observe the sabbatical year. That's the once every 7 years, there's an agricultural cycle where the land is allowed to lie fallow for a year and regenerate, and no manner of agricultural work is done. There's a repetition of the injunction to observe Shabbat. There's the first mention of the three pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. There are more rules about sacrificial offerings. We get that somewhat cryptic line about not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, which of course has become the basis for a whole edifice of kashrut, but it needs some interpretation to get there. This is one of the places where we read that verse. And towards the end of the parsha, the people assent to the covenant. Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and 70 other elders of Israel go up Mount Sinai and or see God, or at least are in God's presence. Moses goes on alone all the way up and spends another 40 days up on Mount Sinai. So briefly, that's Parashat Mishpatim. I think there's a pretty straightforward connection between our Haftarah and our Parsha, which will become evident pretty quickly. But our Haftarah is from the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. And this is a prophetic text we haven't touched in any of these Haftarah study sessions yet. So if you're going to be, I'll have the text up on the screen, but if you're following along at home, we're going to begin in Jeremiah chapter 34 and verse 8. 34:8. Okay. How are we doing so far? Any questions I can answer? You folks would speak up if you had something to ask, I'm sure. Good. Okay. So a little bit of background on Jeremiah. Jeremiah is tough. Jeremiah is a tough book to read. He went through some really dark and troubling events. He had a really difficult personal life. He is, by and large, not the most uplifting of the prophets, and that's saying something considering some of these prophets. So Jeremiah prophesied he got to start roughly the beginning of the last quarter of the 7th century BCE. So his career lasted about 40 years. So like late 7th century to early 6th century. According to the introductory verses of his book, his career lasted about 40 years. And this was really a period of danger and uncertainty for Judah. So in 722 BCE, the northern kingdom, you'll recall after the years of the United Monarchy with King Saul and King David and King Solomon, the northern and southern kingdoms split into two. The northern kingdom, by the time of Jeremiah, has already been destroyed. It was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. Judah, the southern kingdom, barely escaped and barely survived. And in the intervening time since that, now that Jeremiah is starting his prophetic career, Assyria has been overtaken by Babylonia. Babylonia has sort of supplanted Assyria as the major world power to Israel's northeast. And there's a big struggle, two superpowers, actually. One is Babylonia to the northeast in what's present day Iraq, and Egypt. Who's right in between of those two big superpowers? Judah, right? Judah's right in between there as these two, massive empires with massive armies and huge forces are slugging it out with one another. So it's really a time of danger and uncertainty in Judah because they're in a lot of ways not at all in control of their own destiny. Jeremiah served as the prophet to three different kings of Judah. He began in, at least according to his book, he began in the 13th year of Josiah. By our dating, that'd be about 627 BCE is when Jeremiah began. Josiah is, at least from the Tanakh's perspective, a pretty cool guy. Josiah presided over some important religious reforms, and the Bible has a positive view of him, a positive portrayal of Josiah. Josiah, however, was succeeded by someone who the Bible really does not like, and that's Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim was Josiah's son, and he's really portrayed very negatively. The Egyptian pharaoh, so Jehoiakim came to the throne of Judah basically by being put there by the Egyptians. There was a different son of Josiah who was supposed to be the successor, but the Egyptian pharaoh posed that brother and put Jehoiakim on the throne in his place. So but only by virtue of his Egyptian benefactors. So he basically rules Judah as an Egyptian vassal. That is, until Egypt loses a big battle against Babylon, and he switches sides. So he starts out as sort of as paying tribute to Egypt, and then switches and starts paying tribute to Babylon. That lasts all of 3 years before he panics and switches sides again. Babylon then comes and sacks Jerusalem and deposes him. Jehoiakim gets deposed, and another son of Josiah, or Tzidkiyahu, gets put on the throne, this time by Babylon, and he's somehow worse. All he really had to do was keep out of the war in between Egypt and Babylon, but he rebels against Babylon, and that leads to the Babylonian army invading, sacking Jerusalem again, and this time that's the end of things. They destroy the temple the second time around. That takes us down to 586 BCE. That's the beginning of the Babylonian exile, and you know more or less the story from there. So Jeremiah really struggles with these kings. Things go well under Josiah, but these last two, Jehoiakim and then Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah, he really struggled trying to get them to submit to Babylon and not endanger Israel or endanger Judah by rebelling against them. He really is trying to convince them not to rely on Egypt. Seems to be a tendency to want to rely on Egypt as an ally, but this is obviously frowned on from the Bible's perspective. We sort of have a history with the Egyptians, right? They were our slave lords, at this point in the distant past, but that's still within the culture. So Jeremiah is trying to get the kings to submit to Babylon, not rely on Egypt. Like the other prophets, this is also the importance of observing God's Torah, including ethical mitzvot. Jeremiah lived a pretty agonizing life. He was, we won't really get this so much in our Haftarah, but he was repeatedly imprisoned and castigated as a traitor because of basically not doing what these kings, telling these kings what they didn't want to hear. He also really grappled with the theological problems posed by the destruction, and how could a good God who is, supposed to be loyal to Israel, how could God allow this kind of thing to happen to Judah? So he really grapples with those theological problems of the destruction of the nation, the destruction of the temple. And he's really pretty obviously at a lot of points very angry with God. He's really angry about being made to be the one to proclaim judgment against Judah and against his own nation that he cares about. The upside of that for us is that because he struggles so much to understand the tragic events of his lifetime, he in the process reveals a bit more about himself as a person than just about any other prophet. We really get a sense of his anguish and his empathy at the suffering of his people. And we also get this, a sense that he has a firm belief ultimately that the people of Israel would return to their land and rebuild Jerusalem once a period of punishment is over. He lays, he both hands down punishments, but also lays the foundation with his other prophecies for the return from exile. Even though he doesn't live to see that, he prophesies about return from exile and eventual restoration. Okay. So that's a little bit about Jeremiah. What questions do you have about Jeremiah, either as a prophet or about the book itself? Ready to jump in? All right. So let me give you a little background about this Haftarah selection. This is, so in chapter 34, this is the 17 oracles by Jeremiah. At this point in the book of Jeremiah and in the plot of Jeremiah's life, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is already laying siege to Jerusalem. So this began about 2 years before the eventual fall in 586. So this began about 588. In the immediately preceding oracle, Jeremiah has just told Tzidkiyahu has just told Zedekiah that the city is going to fall and be destroyed. So that's like, it just happened. A later author seems to have added kind of some explanatory narrative here that'll open our Haftarah. This is kind of true all throughout Jeremiah. The sort of critical thinking is that he wrote a lot of it, but also someone kind of went back and added some more explanatory notes. So we'll get a little bit of info about these circumstances, and that's how we'll start. I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. So that's what we're getting into in source number 1 here, these first 3 verses from our Haftarah. Could I get a volunteer to read out loud?
I can read.
Go ahead. Thanks, Rachel.
The only problem is, for some reason, let me see if changing my view helps.
Oh, is it small?
No, it's part of it is blocking. There we go. Okay. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah, had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to proclaim a release among them, that everyone should set free their Hebrew slaves, both male and female, and that no one should keep their fellow Judean enslaved. Everyone, officials and people who had entered into the covenant, agreed to set their male and female slaves free and not keep them enslaved any longer. They complied and let them go. But afterward, they turned about and brought back the men and women they had set free and forced them into slavery again.
Okay, thank you. So, like I said, setting the context here, what is the context for this prophecy? What just happened? It would seem that there was some kind of deal made, right? Zedekiah, the king, had made a covenant with all the people of Jerusalem, I think meaning all the people who are slaveholders, to proclaim a release. In other words, to let all the slaves go free. The word translated as release here is dror, which others translate as something like liberty. But anyway, it's sort of an emancipation of slaves. Now, the text doesn't give an explicit motivation here, I don't think. But yeah, it doesn't really give any sort of explicit motivation about why they would enter this into this in the first place, or why they would renege on that deal. So we'll have to figure out a little bit what we think might be going on. But I can tell you that commentaries on these verses explain that since Jerusalem was under siege at this point, Zedekiah entered into the agreement to declare a release for all the slaves in the city, basically to try to do something good and induce God's forgiveness. Either that, or to basically raise more soldiers, release slaves so that they could go and then aid in the city's defense. That's it's never made explicit exactly what their line of thinking was, but it seems like that's probably something along those lines. Okay, I have a question for you though about this. In the last of the three verses, in verse 11, it says afterward. What afterward? After what did they turn around and bring back the men and women they had set free? Any thoughts about what the afterward could be?
I guess I assumed it was after they freed them, but maybe that's not correct.
Oh, no, okay. Okay, I guess I read that. I mean, you're right. So clearly that's what happened. They set them free, and then they made them come back. They re-enslaved them, I guess. I was sort of reading that as implying that there was something that had happened in the interim.
Was there a battle?
Is sort of okay, could be. I think it actually may be just the opposite of that, as a matter of fact. So we learn a couple of chapters later in Jeremiah 37 that Egypt attempted to come to Jerusalem's aid. Egypt sent a relief force to come and try to break the siege, but they were defeated. The Babylonians defeated the Egyptians. The Egyptians withdrew. So the commentaries explain here that Zedekiah, and the other slaveholders must have thought the siege was over. And so that's probably the afterward that's being talked about, because, you think about it from their perspective, all of a sudden the Babylonian army is withdrawing. They were probably going to turn to fight and engage the Egyptians. So, and probably thought, oh, the battle's over. And that was the pretext to bring all the slaves back, and immediately go back on their word. And there's some support for this assumption later on that we can see. But I think that's probably, in terms of the context, pretty likely that's what's going on here, at least for this particular oracle. They've been under siege. It all of a sudden looks like the siege is going to lift, but we know from what happens later in a later chapter that is not the case. And this is in fact the end. This is in fact the end of the road for Jerusalem. Okay. Questions so far about context for these first verses? I think the really cool stuff is a little bit later on. Questions or comments of any sort? All right. Could I get somebody to read the source number 2, the next handful of verses? Who'd like to read?
I don't mind reading.
All right, great. Thanks, Lynn. Go ahead.
Then it was that the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel. Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel. I made a covenant with your ancestors when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, saying, in the 7th year, each of you must let go any fellow Hebrew who may be sold to you. When he has served you 6 years, you must set him free. But your ancestors would not obey me or give ear. Lately, you turned about and did what is proper in my sight, and each of you proclaimed a release to their countrymen. And you made a covenant accordingly before me in the house which bears my name. But now you have turned back and have profaned my name. Each of you has brought back the men and women whom you had given their freedom and forced them to be your slaves again.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynn. So what is the sort of pretext, or what is the specific nature of the complaints here in Jeremiah's prophecy to Tzidkiyahu? It sounds like I think the audience here is Zedekiah and the people who re-enslaved their slaves. What is the specific claim? What is the thing that they did wrong?
They re-enslaved the slaves they had freed.
Yes, but why is that a problem?
There had been a prior covenant from before that.
Okay. So which covenant is that one referring to? So there's the one they just made, the sort of ad hoc deal, sounds like just yesterday, but there's also seems like there's an earlier one. Which one is that, do you think?
The one when they escaped from Egypt.
Good. In other words,
the one from Sinai.
The one at Sinai. Very nice. There you go. Good. So herein, I think, is the connection to our Parsha. And source number 3 down there at the bottom is, in fact, from Parashat Mishpatim. This is pretty much exactly what gets talked about in the Parsha. We get stuff about the sabbatical year, which is a 7-year cycle, but there's another 7-year time period that's important here. In Exodus 21, the first 2 verses say, these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. And it goes on. There's more back exactly about that, but this is the key parts. I can tell you normally I degender most pronouns. I did not do that here because this is specifically for male slaves. The rules are different for female slaves. But basically, the kind of slavery they're referring to here is what you call debt slavery. So a person could become a slave basically in order to pay off a debt. And the law specifies that can only happen for a maximum of 6 years. 6 years is the max term of service, and then in the 7th year, that person needs to be released. I think the motivation here is basically like that debt is not supposed to create sort of slave families, enslave a person and all their descendants forever. It's supposed to be a way to pay off debt. It's like, washing the kitchen for the meal you can't pay for. That's supposed to last only until you've paid off your debt, and then you're done, right? Okay, so a man should go free in the 7th year. There's a way he can get out of this. If he wants to continue to work, he can formally and publicly declare his willingness to remain a slave forever. The laws for women, this comes up in Exodus, it comes up in Deuteronomy as well. The laws for women are slightly different in both places. It's a little bit confusing because we get 2 7-year cycles, right? We get the 7-year cycle for slaves, and we also get that 7-year Shemitah cycle where the land is supposed to lie fallow every 7 years. So it's not totally clear, is this the 7th year of that individual's service? Or is it the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle? Even if, say a person began their service in the 4th year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, does that mean they still go free in the 7th year? It's not totally clear. But it also kind of doesn't matter for our purposes, because going back to Jeremiah, the complaint is that your ancestors would not obey, right? Your ancestors would not obey or give ear. So evidently, regardless of how this was supposed to be working, Zedekiah and the people of Judah were not practicing this. They were not practicing this regular emancipation of debt slaves, right? Okay. However, lately, I love that. I really like this translation of the word hayom, which literally means today. It says hayom, but they translate lately. Not literally today, but, recently, lately. You went around and did what was proper in my sight, right? You actually sort of got back on track. There's, I think, an important, kind of linguistic thing to notice here as well, is in verse 16, but now you have turned back. You have turned back. Anytime you hear about turning in connection with behavior, it's a good chance there's a connection to teshuvah, right? Teshuvah is what we usually translate as repentance, but it literally means turning, as in turning from the bad, wrong path that you're on, turning back onto the right path. And that's exactly the Hebrew here. It says tashuvu, you turned, as in you it's not just a change in behavior, but it's a change in terms of your moral ethic, your compliance with the moral and ethical mitzvah, right? Motivation for Zedekiah, for anyone else, but Jeremiah is relating that, God, I think, took this that they made as whatever it was that was whether they were trying to drum up extra soldiers or curry favor, it kind of doesn't matter. God is sort of viewing this as like, this was a really good thing. You're getting back on track, right? This would have been a really, really positive thing for you to do. Okay. How are we doing so far? Questions about what's been going on or Jeremiah's attitude about it? What else do you notice?
When it says these are the rules that you shall set before them, can you remind me who's speaking to whom?
Oh, in Exodus, you mean?
Mm-hmm. The last one.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's God talking to Moses. Yeah, that's the context. Is God is mediating laws to Moses that Moses then turns around and gives to the people. And this is actually the very beginning of a sort of long list of laws. This is how it starts with these slave laws. So I think that's the pretty obvious connection between Torah portion and Haftarah here is we're dealing with slave laws and this regular emancipation sort of protocol. Good. Anything else before we keep going? All right. Okay. We got another section to read here, and this actually takes us already to the end of the Haftarah. It's really quite a short Haftarah. So could I get a volunteer to read source number 4 there? Sari's got it. Thanks, Sari.
Okay. Assuredly, thus said the Lord, you would not obey me and proclaim a release, each to his kinsmen and countrymen. Lo, I proclaim your release, declares the Lord, to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine, and I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. I will make the men who violated my covenant, who did not fulfill the terms of the covenant which they made before me, like the calf, which they cut in two so as to pass between the halves. The officers of Judah and Jerusalem, the officials, the priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the halves of the calf shall be handed over to their enemies, to those who seek to kill them. Their carcasses shall become food for the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. I will hand over King Zedekiah of Judah and his officers to their enemies who seek to kill them, to the army of the king of Babylon, which has withdrawn from you. I hereby give the command declares the Lord, by which I will bring them back against this city. They shall attack it and capture it and burn it down. I will make the towns of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. Oh, wow.
All right. Pretty bleak, huh? Pretty bleak. So we got right at the end there, I think, the support for that idea that the army of the king of Babylon has withdrawn temporarily and is now, it is going to be coming back. And this is sort of Jeremiah saying, they're coming back, you blew it, and this is the reason why. Okay. What do you make of, in that first verse, there's sort of a word play going on? Did you catch that? A word play on what's that?
I have a really basic boneheaded question.
Not at all. Go ahead, Len.
When Jeremiah says this, is this something that he alone is seeing, or that's obvious to everyone and he's just pointing it out? Like, how does a prophecy work?
So sometimes you get sort of specific context, like this was a prophecy specifically addressed to someone. I skipped over that a little bit because I think it's fairly clear that this is a prophecy directed specifically to Zedekiah, potentially also to some of the the others who were involved in this deal, but he's sort of the one named, right? And he's the one in charge. So I think you can sort of imagine Jeremiah reciting this to Yahoo, like to Zedekiah, maybe either to his face or conveying it, in some other fashion to him. I think that's the idea. He's talking to Zedekiah.
So this is your classic truth to power kind of thing. Or
yeah,
no?
I mean, I think that's the role of the prophet as it's understood. It's sort of almost a foil to the king, right? There's the king is the kind of temporal power, and the prophet is the one who's supposed to, whose role seems to be to keep them on the right path, right? To chastise them when they're doing the wrong thing, let them know when they're doing the right thing, right? So yes, I would say so. Good. Okay. So did you catch the sort of wordplay?
Release. You wouldn't proclaim a release, so I'm going to proclaim a release, and you're not going to like the release I'm going to.
Right. Good. Yeah. So it works in Hebrew too. The God uses Jeremiah uses the word drawer in both cases, but it's sort of like, you were supposed to release the slaves, so I'm going to release the Babylonians' sword. I'm going to release the pestilence. I'm going to release the famine on you, right? Very good. So this is, I would say, a pretty common feature of prophetic texts, in terms of like when prophets are decreeing punishments. It's very often sort of measure for measure. It's like, some sort of repayment in kind for whatever the transgression was. And I think that's exactly what Jeremiah is setting up here. Is like, I don't know if these are actually, balanced or not, but he's sort of framing it that way. Your transgression was a failure to release, so here comes a release of punishment upon you, right? Very good. There's a pretty weird part in here that may not be totally familiar. Verse 18, right? So I will make the men who violated my covenant, who did not fulfill the terms of the covenant they made before me, like the calf which they cut in two so as to pass between the halves. Okay. Now this is sort of a Bible knowledge quiz. Does that remind anyone of any other events in Tanakh?
Sure.
I suppose you can always just read down the page, because obviously that's where I'm going next.
Yeah, I did notice down the page plus in the plout.
Oh, it has it?
In front of me, it also cites that section. So that's the covenant between the pieces that Abraham made with God, or God made with Abraham.
Good. Okay. So this is sort of a weird incident from Abraham's story. The covenant between the pieces, or the Brit Ben HaBetarim in Hebrew. And this is something that it actually unfolds apparently in a vision. This passage begins with Abraham sort of being in a trance or dreamlike state or something like that, where he has this experience of communication with God. So Richard, since you got it, do you mind reading source 5 for us about what happens there?
Sure. Then God said to Avram, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to assign this land to you as a possession. And he said, O Lord God, how shall I know that I am to possess it? God answered, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. He brought God all these and cut them in two, placing each half opposite the other. But he did not cut up the bird. ...
Yeah.
Okay, when the sun set and it was very dark, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between those pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Avram, saying, to your offspring I assigned this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
Yeah, you know all those folks, right? Great job with those pronunciations. That can be pretty tricky. So, yes, I trimmed here a little bit to fit on the page and get just the context. But what seems to be happening here is the sealing of a contract between God and Avram. This is before the name change to Abraham, where Abraham's like, I need some kind of assurance from you that I'm going to come and possess the land. So God says, okay, we're going to kind of do a deal. And the way they affirm that this contract essentially is that they do this ritual where they cut animals in two and they place them opposite one another. And then crucially, there's this part where a smoking oven, a flaming torch passes between the pieces. Now, I think we're pretty safe to say that represents God in this transaction. God is the one sort of passing between the pieces. So this ritual of cutting animals in half and then passing between them is found not only in Jeremiah, not only in Genesis, but is actually fairly well known from other places, treaties in the ancient Near Eastern world. It was a way of basically formally ratifying a contract. The essence of the ritual seems to kind of be like a self-curse, where it's sort of like, if I break this covenant, I'm going to be, let me be cut in half, just like this animal, right? Whoever walks through it, it's like, let me be like this dead animal if I violate the covenant. And by both parties doing that, they both symbolically affirm. It's sort of like, signing your name on the page, but it was a formalized ritual before they had documents like that. What's really notable about the one in Genesis is that Abraham doesn't pass through the middle of the pieces, only God does symbolically. But that's a drash for another day. That's an interpretation for another day. I've heard claims, and this is totally anecdotal. I have no idea how real this connection is or not, but that this is the origin of our idiom to cut a deal. And I have no idea if that's true. This is cut deal,
No.
as it were. It's not what you've heard, Margaret? You've heard something different?
I've
heard that, but I don't think there's any evidence.
You cut a deal with a tally stick. For people who couldn't read and write, you cut notches in a stick of how much you owed, and then you split it and you each have a half.
Right.
And when you come to collect, the halves match. You can't add to it.
Sure. So I've heard that. I've heard that too, and I think that one also makes sense, and is almost certainly right. The connection here to this Brita Bena Bedarim seems pretty, tenuous, but anyhow. So that seems to be exactly what Jeremiah is invoking here. The people who broke this covenant, it's time to pay. You're going to be literally cut in half because of the way you violated this covenant. The officers of Judah and Jerusalem, officials, the priests, they'll all be handed over to their enemies, those who seek to kill them.
I'm not sure if this is super tangential, but I was just curious. Why does he not cut up the bird?
I don't remember. That does seem weird, and it's not addressed in the text. I'm sure some commentator has thought of that. I would have to go back and look, though. I don't remember.
I was just curious.
Yeah, I remember learning this in rabbinical school, and I feel like that's the kind of question we would have asked, but I don't remember. Yeah, it is sort of weird. It's a very strange text, the one in Bereshit. Okay. So good. So like I said, I think the interpretation of the Babylonian army had temporarily moved away from Jerusalem. They're going to come back. I think that's really, makes sense given what we have here, that the army withdrew. We sort of connect the dots with what we learn later about the Egyptians showing up to try to relieve the siege but failing. Okay. So this is the end of this oracle, right? And would be the end of this Haftarah. As you can imagine, the book of Jeremiah gets even more bleak from here. Jerusalem finally falls in chapter 39. Basically, nothing else good happens through the whole rest of the book, all the way to chapter 52, where it ends. This passage, from Jeremiah 34, was chosen, I think, to be the prophetic unit read as the Haftarah for Parashat Mishpatim because of the slave law connection, right? Potentially also the sabbatical year connection, but definitely the slave law connection. However, can you imagine reading this in synagogue and having the last lines be, "They shall attack and capture it, burn it down, and will make the towns of Judah a desolation without inhabitant"? Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone, right? Like that's not a good idea. It's not a good way to end. So what seems to have happened is that the tradition became to pull a couple of verses from Jeremiah from a little bit earlier. So the actual end of the Haftarah is chapter number 6, or source number 6, back in chapter 33, verses 25 and 26. This is taken from the end of an earlier set of oracles that are actually more positive ones. These are oracles concerning return from exile and eventual restoration. And here it says much more nicely, "Thus says the Lord, as surely as I've established my covenant with day and night, the laws of heaven and earth, so I will never reject the offspring of Jacob and my servant David. I will never fail to take from his offspring rulers for the descendants of Isaac and Jacob. Indeed, I will restore their fortunes and take them back in love." Now, that's a much nicer way to end, right? I think that's really nice. I think there's a little bit we can find that's interesting here too, though. What do you make of that line? As surely as my covenant with day and nights. What's the sort of? I think this is kind of a poetic allusion here. What is that first verse trying to say to us?
Well, day and night never fail. I mean, it's predictable. It's as predictable as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, right? I mean, it's something you can count on. The
sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. I think I really like this too. It's sort of.
Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, is it also kind of a way of invoking an image of sort of dark times and lighter times, kind of like no matter what, also, I'll be regular, I'll be there for you in the dark.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah, and I kind of really like the way, like in the creation narrative, God just speaks and things happen. it's never really framed as a covenant, but like day and night are kind of personified here, right? It's sort of saying God made a covenant, sort of made a deal with the sun and the moon almost, right? With the day and the nights, like that. It's a contract, and just like Rachel said, that's never going to stop. That contract is now sort of part of the natural order of the world, just as certain as that contract is our contract between God and the people of Israel, right? So I kind of like this sort of, yeah, kind of poetic metaphor, as if day and night, sun and moon are covenanting with God just in the same way we are, right? Good. And it ends on an uplifting note, right? I will restore their fortunes and take them back in love. As we wrap up reading the Haftarah and move into discussion questions, we sort of have two texts to work with, because these are from two different oracles, right? Our first discussion question is always, how did this text speak to people at the time when it was written? So we sort of have to ask that about these two different parts, right? There's the oracle about Zedekiah and punishment is coming. And there's also this little text about restoration will be coming. So I think it's a little bit difficult to answer, but what are your thoughts? How did this text? Maybe we'll start with the main one, the one about Zedekiah and the slavers. How do you think this text spoke to people at the time when it was written, or maybe at the time when it was prophesied?
Well, it was taking something that was very familiar and part of their history and tradition. Well, a couple of things. Well, no, yeah, a couple of things. One being, the rule about after 7 years you release your slaves, and the other one being the covenant between the pieces. So, I mean, in that sense, it was using some very familiar things as metaphors. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but.
Yeah, close enough. Yeah, I would hope it would have like sort of impacted on that level by drawing on the known sources, right? Yeah, good. Lynn, what were you gonna say something?
I was thinking that regarding the releasing of the slaves, that it seems like a message might be, even in extremely tough times, even the highest leader is held to account for that promise, and that it's not just when it's good times, and that's not just for folks who are not in positions of authority, but it's really for everyone.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense to me in terms of how this text might have spoken to Jews who read it sort of in between now and then. At the time, though, I guess like the people who this oracle was addressed to clearly thought Jeremiah was full of crap, right? Like Zedekiah did not listen to this. He re-enslaved his slaves anyway. Clearly did not take that message to heart, right?
Yeah, and given our current times, I think that it's seeing our leaders being held to account can hold us all to account, or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is a tough one, I feel like, for analyzing how it spoke to people at the time, because it's not even a warning, this one. It's just a declaration that punishment is coming. Like it seems like, by the time Jeremiah prophesied, all the steps were taken. There was never even you better listen, you better let those slaves stay free, or something like that. There was, I don't know, it's hard to sort of put myself in Zedekiah's shoes here and think about how I would have reacted to this. It would, in any way other than, well, I guess we'll find out, right? When either Nebuchadnezzar comes back or he doesn't. So maybe more interesting is how do you feel like this this text might have spoken to Jewish communities between now and then as a Haftarah? And now I think we can look at the whole thing, those verses at the end. Why do you think? Why read this of all our options for Parashat Mishpatim? What do you think, Jewish communities might have heard in this?
It seems like it's saying a promise is a promise. I mean, if you have to take this stuff very seriously. If you commit to something, whether it's a covenant or just an agreement or something you sign off on, it's forever. It's forever. It stays. It's not, it's not going anywhere.
And it might also, because a promise is a promise, it might also be, don't take on a debt slave if you're not, consider what you're doing when you extend debt to someone. It's a long-term consequences for many people.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think I like what Sarah's saying. I think there's a contracts are important, and need to be taken seriously, not just the which obviously this text is encouraging us to and have faith in, but also human to human contracts, right? Those have consequences on an order beyond just our interactions with other people. They have consequences. God's paying attention to those too. And what Lynn said, in terms of the specific case of the debt slave, I'm not enough of a scholar to know how long that practice maintained in Jewish communities after the temple period. So this would have, we don't know exactly when the Haftarah would have began. So I feel like this reads differently if you are in the business of holding debt slaves versus if you are not. That's already something in the past. You know what I mean? I kind of want to read this as an anti-slavery text in some ways, which I feel like I don't know. I feel like I need a lot of the time. The Bible sort of tacitly accepts slavery as an institution. It regulates it, but it never says slavery should is a moral wrong and should be done away with completely. So I feel like maybe this read as almost a counterbalance to Parashat Mishpatim. I could imagine hearing Mishpatim in synagogue and sort of getting the impression like, oh, the Bible, kind of thinks slavery is okay, or the Torah kind of thinks slavery is okay. And it's something that, should be regulated, but is still something that we can do. And then hearing this as like, here's what happens to people who hold slaves. Right, the sort of a counterpoint almost. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, initially these slaves, it's not like they were captured and kidnapped. They owed a debt, and my understanding of that the institution was that they said, okay, it was a way for them to work off their debt in a time where, they couldn't go to a bank and get a loan. They couldn't, draw money against their credit card.
Right.
It was the way things were done in the ancient world. But the sin was in releasing them and then forcing them to come back. That was just a great evil and cruelty. And I think it's that might be specifically what this text is militating against. Just my impression in 2 cents.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's totally plausible too. Yeah, I kind of can't decide how much I want to read this as sort of specifically just angry at Zedekiah for breaking his word, and specifically or generally angry at the institution of slavery. I'm not. Sarah or Richard, did you have? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. It makes me think about the sequence of events in American history where the slaves were set free by the Emancipation Proclamation, but then following you had the institution of sharecropping, which was basically a form of slavery, but it didn't look exactly like slavery had looked in the past. but it was a way of
Right.
keeping people under the thumb of poverty and abuse. And so I could definitely see God in that instance speaking out against sharecropping and other things that were done to keep people from being fully who they were.
Yeah. So that's, I sort of had that thought. Yeah, I feel like you're on a little bit to, kind of speak to us now. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's hard for me as an American to read about slavery and not sort of Americanize the concept, right? And to hear specifically African-American slavery being addressed and talked to, even though obviously, the Bible itself had no idea. Like it's hard for me not to hear that. So then there's another way that I almost want to read this as like a Rachel Justice, kind of a text, along the lines of what you're saying, almost a re-enslaving without totally enslaving, but still exploiting, taking advantage of, something like that. Yeah, I think that's a powerful read too.